A struggling waitress loses her home only to inherit a rotting sunken houseboat from an eccentric diner regular. It sounded like a cruel joke until she dove into the murky water and found a heavy steel safe welded to the floorboards. Inside over $100 million in untraceable secrets, the pink eviction notice taped to apartment 4B wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a death sentence for Minna Higgins's life in Key Largo. For 3 years, Minna had worked double shifts at the Salty Pelican Diner, serving rubbery eggs and lukewarm coffee to tourists and local fishermen. She was 28, chronically exhausted, and exactly 3 months behind on rent. When she peeled the notice off her peeling front door, the sticky residue left behind felt like a metaphor for her life, messy, stubborn, and impossible to wash away. Minna packed her life into 3 trash bags and 2 cardboard boxes. She had no family to call, no safety net to fall back on, and exactly $42 in her checking account. For the next 3 nights, she slept in the back of her rusted 2004 Honda Civic, parked under the flickering neon light of the diner's back parking lot. Her only solace was the routine of the diner. Amidst the chaos of clinking silverware and shouting line cooks, there was Arthur. Arthur Pendleton was an 82-year-old fixture at booth number 3. He wore the same moth-eaten tweed jacket every day, regardless of the sweltering Florida heat, and always ordered a black coffee and a single piece of dry sourdough toast. Most of the waitstaff ignored him, irritated by his meager orders and his tendency to leave pennies as tips. But Minna saw something else in the old man's milky blue eyes, a profound, anchoring loneliness. She would sneak him extra slices of cherry pie, refill his coffee for free, and listen to his rambling stories about the ocean and the hidden currents of the world. "You're a good egg, Minna," Arthur told her, one rainy Tuesday, tapping his skeletal fingers against his coffee mug. "The world is full of sharks, but you're a dolphin. You navigate the dark waters with grace." "Thanks, Arthur," she had replied, forcing a smile despite the ache in her back from sleeping in her car. "I just wish dolphins didn't have to pay rent." Arthur hadn't laughed. He just stared at her, intensely nodded once, and left. That was the last time Minna ever saw him. 3 days later, Arthur Pendleton died of a sudden stroke. Minna mourned the old man in her own quiet way, shedding tears in the walk-in freezer between lunch rushes. She assumed that was the end of it, another ghost in a life full of disappearances. But 2 weeks after Arthur's passing, a man in a sharp, charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit walked into the Salty Pelican. He stuck out like a sore thumb among the flip-flops and fishing shirts. "I'm looking for Minna Higgins," he announced, his voice slicing through the diner's hum. Minna wiped her hands on her apron and approached him cautiously. "That's me. Did you need a table?" "No," the man said, handing her a pristine, cream-colored business card. It read, "Richard Gable, Attorney at Law, Estate Management and Probate. I'm here regarding the estate of the late Arthur Pendleton. We need you to come to my office immediately. It concerns your inheritance." Minna nearly dropped her notepad. Inheritance. From Arthur, the man who paid for toast in loose change. An hour later, Minna was sitting in a high-rise office in downtown Miami, the air conditioning so aggressive she shivered in her thin cotton dress. Attorney Gable sat across a massive mahogany desk, sliding a thick, leather-bound folder toward her. Mr. Pendleton was not the destitute man he portrayed himself to be. "Ms. Higgins," Gable said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He was, in fact, a former hedge fund manager and a private investor of considerable wealth. Upon his passing, he left the bulk of his estate, liquid assets, real estate, and trusts to his estranged daughter, Rebecca. Minna swallowed hard. Okay, so why am I here? Because, Gable sighed, looking almost annoyed. Arthur added a bizarre codicil to his will exactly 1 week before his death. He explicitly left a singular specific piece of property to you. Minna's heart hammered against her ribs. Property, a house, a condo. Could her days of sleeping in a Honda Civic finally be over? Gable flipped open a document. He has bequeathed to you a vessel registered under the name the Sea Nymph. It is a custom-built 50-foot houseboat. Tears of absolute relief pricked Minna's eyes. A houseboat. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a roof. It was a bed. It was salvation. Where is it docked? She asked, her voice trembling. Gable's expression remained entirely flat. He cleared his throat. It isn't docked, Ms. Higgins. The Sea Nymph sank 5 years ago during Hurricane Irma. It is currently resting in 20 feet of water in an isolated cove off the northern tip of Key Largo. The vessel was never salvaged. It is entirely submerged, rotting, and by all insurance metrics completely worthless. The bottom fell out of Minna's stomach. The relief vanished instantly, replaced by a cruel, biting humiliation. It was a joke. The old man in his dementia, or his twisted sense of humor, had left her a pile of underwater garbage. She was now the proud owner of an environmental hazard. I don't understand, Minna whispered, staring at the paperwork. Why would he leave me a sunken boat? Mr. Pendleton was a highly eccentric man, Gable replied coldly. I advise you to simply sign the refusal of inheritance. If you accept ownership, you may eventually be held liable by the county for the environmental cleanup and removal of the wreck, which could cost you upwards of $30,000. Minna picked up the pen. She was about to sign the refusal to wash her hands of Arthur Pendleton and his phantom houseboat. But as the nib of the pen touched the paper, she remembered Arthur's intense stare. She remembered his words. You navigate the dark waters with grace. Arthur wasn't cruel. He was strange, but he wasn't cruel. Why leave a drowning girl a sunken boat, she thought. Unless the boat is a life raft. Minna slowly pulled the pen away. I want to see it, she said. Gable frowned. Ms. Higgins, I strongly advise against. I accept the inheritance. Minna interrupted, her voice suddenly firm. She grabbed the ownership transfer document and signed her name with a sharp, decisive scrawl. Give me the coordinates. Minna stood on the edge of a splintering wooden dock, peering out over the murky, mangrove-choked waters of Miller's Cove. It was a desolate, forgotten stretch of the Keys, accessible only by a bumpy dirt road. Next to her stood Tommy Gallagher, a childhood friend who ran a local under-the-table marine salvage operation. Tommy was built like a cinder block with sun-bleached hair and arms covered in faded nautical tattoos. You're crazy, Minna, Tommy said, adjusting his polarized sunglasses as he stared at the water. I remember when the Sea Nymph went down. Irma ripped her from her moorings and smashed her against the reef before dragging her into this cove. She's been sitting in the mud for half a decade. The salt and the barnacles have eaten her alive. I own her now, Tommy, Minna said stubbornly, pointing to a dark rectangular shadow lurking just beneath the surface of the green water. The skeletal remains of the houseboat's upper deck were barely visible. Arthur left it to me for a reason. I need you to dive down there with me and see what's inside. Tommy sighed, scratching his beard. Look, I brought the scuba gear, but I'm telling you, it's going to be a graveyard of rusted pans and waterlogged furniture. If you're looking for a hidden stash of cash paper money turns to mush in seawater. If it's gold, the looters would have picked it clean years ago. Before Minna could argue, the crunch of gravel behind them broke the silence of the swamp. A sleek, black Mercedes G-Wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the dirt road. The door swung open, and a woman stepped out looking entirely out of place amidst the mud and mosquitoes. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, a crisp white linen suit, and an expression of profound distaste. Minna recognized her immediately from the photos on the lawyer's desk. It was Rebecca Pendleton Arthur's estranged daughter, and the sole heir to his multi-million-dollar fortune. "Minna Higgins, I presume," Rebecca said, her heels clicking loudly on the wooden dock as she approached. Her voice was smooth, but laced with poison. "That's me," Minna said, stepping forward. Tommy crossed his massive arms, acting as an unspoken bodyguard. Rebecca stopped a few feet away, taking off her sunglasses, to reveal eyes as coldly blue as her father's, but entirely devoid of his warmth. "I'll make this quick, Miss Higgins. My father was a senile, foolish old man in his final months. His mind was slipping. Leaving you this piece of aquatic trash was a mistake." "The lawyers didn't think so," Minna replied, keeping her chin up. "The lawyers only care about the paperwork," Rebecca snapped. "I care about my family's legacy. I don't want strangers owning pieces of my father's estate, even the worthless ones. It's a matter of principle. I am prepared to offer you $5,000 right now, in cash, to sign over the deed to the sea nymph." Minna froze. $5,000. It was more money than she had seen in a year. It meant a deposit on a new apartment. It meant hot meals. It meant she wouldn't have to sleep in her car tonight. She looked at Tommy, who raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the offer. But then Minna looked back at the dark shadow in the water. If this boat is a piece of worthless aquatic trash, she thought, why did an heiress just drive 2 hours into a mosquito-infested swamp to buy it from me? Arthur was a former hedge fund manager. He understood value. Rebecca understood value. "No," Minna said, the word slipping out before she could second-guess it. Rebecca's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me, did you mishear me? $5,000 for a rotting pile of wood." "I heard you perfectly," Minna said, her heart pounding. "The boat is mine. It's not for sale." Rebecca's face darkened, the polite veneer cracking instantly. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You listen to me, you pathetic little waitress. You are playing a game you don't understand with people who will crush you. You think there's a treasure down there. You'll drown before you find anything of value. Sell me the boat, or I will tie you up in litigation so fast you won't be able to afford the gas in your broken-down car." "Get off my dock," Minna said, her voice shaking, but her resolve ironclad. Tommy uncrossed his arms and took a step toward the heiress. "You heard the lady. Kick rocks." Rebecca glared at them both, her jaw tight. She shoved her sunglasses back onto her face. "You'll regret this, Minna. I promise you that." She turned, stormed back to her G-Wagon, and sped off in a cloud of dust. Minna exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her knees felt weak. "Well," Tommy said, letting out a low whistle. "If I wasn't curious before, I sure as hell am now. Suit up, Higgins. We're going diving." 20 minutes later, Minna was encased in a thick neoprene wetsuit, a regulator in her mouth, and a heavy tank strapped to her back. The water of the cove was surprisingly warm, but as soon as she and Tommy descended beneath the surface, the Florida sun vanished, replaced by a murky emerald-green gloom. Tommy switched on his high-powered underwater flashlight, the beam cutting through the suspended silt and schools of tiny silver fish. There, resting on the silty bottom, was the sea nymph. It looked like a ghost ship. Algae and barnacles coated the hull in thick green-grey armor. The windows were blown out, and the roof of the cabin had partially caved in. Minna's heart sank slightly. Tommy had been right. It was a ruin. They swam through what used to be the sliding glass doors of the main living area. The interior was a chaotic mess of waterlogged debris. Rusted light fixtures dangled from the ceiling like dead spiders. A television set lay half buried in the mud on the floor. Tommy signaled to Minna, pointing his light toward the back of the boat, the master bedroom. They kicked their way through the narrow hallway, moving carefully to avoid jagged pieces of broken wood. When they entered the bedroom, Tommy's flashlight beam swept across the space. The bed was gone, reduced to a metal frame. The dresser had disintegrated, but in the center of the floor, completely untouched by the structural collapse around it, was a massive rectangular block of solid steel. Minna swam closer, her eyes wide behind her mask. It wasn't just a safe. It was a custom-built, commercial-grade bank vault door embedded horizontally directly into the heavy steel decking of the hull. It was roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, secured by a complex, multi-spoke rotary combination dial. The steel was surprisingly clean, coated in a thick layer of industrial marine grease that had protected it from the saltwater corrosion. Tommy swam over, running his gloved hand over the massive dial. He looked at Minna, his eyes wide with shock behind his diving mask. He pointed to the vault, then made a gesture with his hands, mimicking an explosion. "This is massive." Minna reached out and wiped away a layer of grease near the top corner of the vault. Etched deep into the steel were 3 numbers: 4, 11, 82. April 11th, 1982. Minna recognized the date instantly. It was the birth date she had written down on a diner loyalty card she had filled out for Arthur months ago. He hadn't just left her a boat. He had left her a puzzle tailored specifically to her. As Minna stared at the vault, a sudden chilling realization washed over her. This boat didn't sink by accident. It was built far too heavily in the hull to be a standard houseboat. It was designed to hold the weight of a commercial bank vault. Arthur Pendleton hadn't bought a houseboat that tragically sank. He had built a secret underwater fortress, and he had intentionally sunk it here to hide it from the world and from his daughter. And now Minna held the key. Minna and Tommy broke the surface of the water, gasping for air as the warm Florida sun hit their faces. Minna ripped off her diving mask, her chest heaving, not from oxygen deprivation, but from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "Did you see that?" She choked out, treading water next to Tommy's rusted salvage pontoon. "Tommy, that was a bank vault." Tommy hauled himself over the side of the boat, water cascading off his wetsuit. He reached down and hoisted Minna up onto the deck. "I saw it, Higgins. A solid steel, waterproof marine vault. I've heard rumors of cartel bosses sinking safes like that off the coast of Colombia. But a retired diner, regular in Key Largo, it doesn't make any sense." "He was a hedge fund manager," Minna said, stripping off her neoprene gloves. "And he knew my birthday, April 11th, 1982. That's the combination. We have to go back down." Tommy grabbed her arm, his grip tight. He nodded toward the tree line bordering the muddy road where they had parked. A metallic glint caught the afternoon sun. It was the lens of a pair of binoculars partially hidden behind the dense mangrove leaves. "We're being watched," Tommy muttered, keeping his voice dangerously low. "Rebecca might have left the dock, but she didn't leave the cove. She knows something is down there. If we pull anything up right now, her private security will be on us before we can even get the engine started." Minna's blood ran cold. The inheritance was legal, but out here in the isolated swamps of the Keys, legality often took a back seat to leverage and force. "So what do we do?" "We leave," Tommy said loudly, dropping a wrench onto the metal deck to make it sound like they were packing up. "We drive back to town, grab a burger, and act like we just found a boat full of mud. But tonight at 2 a.m., we come back with lift bags, bolt cutters, and absolutely zero lights. The wait was agonizing. Minna spent the evening in Tommy's cramped trailer, pacing the floorboards, while Tommy prepped high-capacity underwater lift bags, heavy-duty balloons, designed to float sunken cars and boulders to the surface. At 1:30 a.m., they slipped back into Miller's Cove under the cover of a new moon. The swamp was alive with the sound of cicadas and the occasional splash of a bullfrog. Tommy had swapped his noisy outboard motor for a silent electric trolling motor, gliding the pontoon over the coordinates of the sea nymph like a ghost. They slipped into the pitch-black water. Diving at night was a sensory deprivation nightmare. The only illumination was the faint, red-filtered tactical flashlight mounted to Tommy's wrist, casting eerie blood-colored shadows against the barnacle-encrusted hull of the houseboat. They swam back into the ruined master bedroom. The vault loomed in the red light, an immovable monolith of secrets. Minna positioned herself over the massive rotary dial. Her hands were shaking inside her dive gloves. She cleared the dial, spinning it past 03 times to reset the internal tumblers. Right to 04. She turned the heavy steel wheel. It was sluggish, resisting the water pressure, but the marine grease allowed it to slide into place with a heavy, satisfying thunk that vibrated through the water. Left past 04, stopping on 11. Minna hauled the dial counter, clockwise. Her lungs burned. She checked her air pressure gauge. She was burning through her oxygen too fast due to anxiety. Right to 82. She twisted it one final time, the dial locking into place perfectly. Tommy swam up beside her, grabbing the massive locking lever. He braced his boots against the steel floorboards and pulled with all his might. The water around them swirled with disturbed silt. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that sounded like a dying whale, the internal locking bars retracted. Tommy pulled the lever down. The heavy vault door swung upward on hydraulic hinges. Minna aimed her flashlight inside. She expected to see ruined, soggy paper. Instead, she found a secondary airtight titanium hatch with a simple pressure release valve. Arthur had spared zero expense. Tommy released the valve with a hiss of escaping pressure and popped the inner lid. Inside the dry, pressurized chamber sat 4 identical, waterproof Pelican cases. Working in frantic, practiced unison, Tommy and Minna attached the deflated lift bags to the handles of the heavy cases. Tommy cracked the valve on a small secondary air tank, inflating the canvas bags. One by one, the cases tore free from the vault, shooting upward, toward the surface of the cove like torpedoes. They had done it. Minna had claimed her inheritance. But as they kicked their way toward the surface, a blinding, piercing white light suddenly cut through the black water above them. Minna broke the surface immediately, squinting against the harsh glare of a police-grade searchlight. It wasn't attached to a police boat, however. The light was mounted to the bow of a sleek, black center console speedboat that had silently blockaded Tommy's pontoon. "Well, well," a familiar venomous voice rang out over the water. I knew my father couldn't resist a dramatic gesture, and I knew a desperate waitress couldn't resist taking the bait. Rebecca Pendleton stood at the helm of the speedboat, looking perfectly composed in a dark trench coat. Flanking her were 2 massive men in tactical gear. One of them, a scarred man Rebecca referred to as Carter, leveled a heavy-duty spear gun directly at Tommy's chest. "Get the cases on board," Rebecca ordered her men. "This is piracy." Rebecca, Minna shouted, treading water next to the floating Pelican cases. "This boat and everything on it legally belongs to me." "Oh, sweetie, property laws are incredibly fluid out here." Rebecca laughed coldly. My father was hiding offshore assets from the IRS and from my corporate restructuring of his firm. Those cases belong to the Pendleton estate. Now pass them up, or Carter is going to test out his aim. Tommy growled, but Minna placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking her head. She wouldn't let him die for money. Defeated, they pushed the floating cases toward the speedboat. Carter and the other man hauled them onto the pristine teak deck, snapping the heavy latches open. "Let's see what the crazy old man was hiding," Rebecca murmured, stepping forward. Carter flipped the lid of the first case. Even in the harsh glare of the spotlight, the contents were breathtaking. The case was packed to the brim with stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds, completely untraceable financial instruments. The second case held rows of heavy glittering gold bullion. The third contained sealed hardware wallets, undoubtedly loaded with tens of millions in cryptocurrency. "Over $100 million in untraceable liquid assets," Rebecca whispered, her eyes wide with greed. "The old fool actually did it. Open the fourth one," Minna demanded, her voice suddenly steady, cutting through the heiress's triumph. Rebecca smirked. "Why, hoping he left you a nice tip." She nodded to Carter. Carter opened the final case. There was no gold inside, no bonds, only a thick, bright blue folder, and a handwritten letter sealed in a waterproof sleeve. The letter had Minna's name written on the front. "Read it," Minna challenged. Rebecca snatched the letter, tearing open the plastic sleeve. As she read her father's handwriting, the blood completely drained from her face. Her arrogant smirk dissolved into a mask of pure terror. "What does it say?" Carter asked, glancing nervously at his boss. Rebecca didn't answer. Her hands were shaking violently. Minna swam closer to the boat, staring daggers at the woman who had tried to bully her. "I'll tell you what it says, Rebecca. Arthur told me you were trying to force him into a conservatorship. He told me you were embezzling from the family firm to cover your massive gambling debts in Macau." Rebecca gasped, taking a step back. "Arthur didn't sink that safe to hide his money from the IRS. Minna continued, her voice echoing across the silent cove. "He hid it to protect it from you. And that blue folder that contains every wire transfer, every forged signature, and every piece of evidence proving you stole $50 million from your own clients." "Shut up," Rebecca screamed, dropping the letter. "Carter, throw the blue folder in the water. Now, Sai." But before Carter could move, the swamp was suddenly illuminated by flashing blue and red lights. Two heavily armed Coast Guard interceptor boats burst from the surrounding mangrove channels, their sirens wailing, completely boxing in Rebecca's speedboat. Tommy let out a booming laugh, slapping the water. "Did you really think we were going to pull up a billionaire's hidden vault without calling in a little insurance? Becky, I've had the Coast Guard on speed dial since 1 a.m. A voice blared over the Coast Guard megaphone. "Cut your engines and step away from the cases. You are surrounded." Rebecca slumped against the console of her boat, the fight completely leaving her body. The inheritance was lost. Her freedom was gone. Arthur Pendleton had orchestrated his final brilliant maneuver from beyond the grave, using a waitress and a sunken boat to trap the daughter who had betrayed him. 3 weeks later, the Salty Pelican diner looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere had entirely changed. Minna Higgins wasn't wearing an apron. She was sitting in booth number 3, Arthur's booth, wearing a tailored sundress, sipping a cup of black coffee. Across from her sat attorney Richard Gable, who looked decidedly more respectful than he had in Miami. "The bearer bonds and the gold have been officially cleared by the probate court. Ms. Higgins," Gable said, sliding a thick stack of finalized paperwork across the table. Since the assets were legally inside the fixtures of the Sea Nymph, and the blue folder proved Rebecca's criminal forfeiture, the state has recognized your full ownership. After taxes, your liquid net worth sits at exactly $112 million. Minna signed the final document with a smooth, practiced stroke. And the diner? Purchased in full, Gable confirmed. You are now the sole owner of the Salty Pelican. Furthermore, the $2 million investment into Mr. Gallagher's new marine salvage company has been wired successfully. Minna smiled, looking out the diner window. Tommy's brand-new state-of-the-art salvage vessel was parked in the harbour, gleaming in the morning sun. She picked up her coffee mug, raising it slightly toward the empty seat across from her. Arthur had been right. The world was full of sharks, but with a little bit of grace and a sunken steel vault, a dolphin could rule the ocean. Did Minna's incredible journey from an evicted waitress to a multi-millionaire leave you absolutely speechless? Arthur's ultimate revenge proves that kindness is always the best investment, and the greatest treasures are often hidden just beneath the surface. If you loved this thrilling, true-to-life saga of betrayal, mystery, and sweet justice, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping dramatic tales.